No.
Thanks, Mo. Thanks, Kelsey, and thank you all for persisting through and getting on here. Here, let me start sharing my screen. It's good to see y'all's faces. Hey, Lee, I'm glad you're here. So I've been asked to do a Western drought update again. It's never drought-free all everywhere, but I've got a mix of good news and bad news for today to share with you. If I get a little sniffly in the middle of this, it's because I'm a bit under the weather, unfortunately. But here's the summary. Um, Drought conditions are persisting across the Central Plains, and I'm going to show you that in a minute, with extreme drought conditions along the Gulf Coast. This is important because the Gulf Coast and Texas are sort of a harbinger of things to come for the rest of our Western hydrologic basins. So the fact that we're seeing such dramatic and extreme drought along the Gulf Coast is troubling. Drought is increasing in the Northern Rockies. We've actually seen an increase into D3 conditions in portions of the Northern Rockies over the last 2 weeks, and may continue to worsen into the fall given our outlook. Recapping from earlier this summer, the historic snowpack that we had across California, the Great Basin, and the lower Colorado River filled California reservoirs, but Colorado River reservoirs are still well below full pull for this time of year. And then our Missouri reservoirs are about average. We still are seeing high fire risk that will continue through the fall, especially in the Pacific Northwest and Great Lakes regions in Hawaii. And then the big story is just that we're entering a relatively strong El Nino pattern for this coming winter. And we'll talk about some of the impacts of that. So here's our current drought status. This is the USDM drought map from last week. What we see is, as I was talking about, the really exceptional drought conditions, D4 drought in central Texas through the Louisiana Gulf Coast and over into the Florida Panhandle a bit. We also see spots of exceptional drought all the way through the eastern high plains and Midwest. This has been a real hotspot in terms of drought this summer. What we see here in the Pacific Northwest and in Northern Rockies is what I was talking about, where we've got D3 cropping up, a spot of D4, in fact, across the High Line here in Montana. And this really has impacts on hydrologic activity on our rivers going into the wintertime, but also on river and reservoir storage across the Columbia River Basin. So it's something to really watch. Here's my illustration of where we are and how we got there. I'm just going to zoom forward to the last couple of years. And what we can see is those drought conditions across the West that we had in 21 going into 22. But by the end of 22 and last winter, those really ameliorate. And we see because of all of those atmospheric rivers that were coming across California, across the Sierra Nevadas, across the Great Basin, and sort of swooping up from southwest to northeast. We have a nice large area of the West now that's out of drought, but that didn't hit up here in the Northern Rockies and especially the Columbia River Basin, and it really didn't help the Arkansas River, the Red River, and Texas at all. And so we still see fairly extreme drought conditions across New Mexico and Texas and portions of the Arkansas White and Red Rivers basins. So the next thing I'm going to show you is the sort of history of drought for the last couple of years and the last 20 years across all of these basins. I just want you to get a sense of where they are. The plots that you're going to see are going to go from approximately the Pacific Northwest down to the Texas Gulf. So coming across in rows. And that's what this looks like here. The Pacific Northwest up here at the top, Missouri River, California, Great Basin, and so on and so forth. And this is the percent of each of those basins in each of these drought categories. What we see is the large drought that we had from 2020 ending in this last winter that really progressed from the southeast towards the northwest over all of these basins and really impacted the Rio Grande and the western basins, Rio Grande, the Colorado basins, the Great Basin, California, and then the Missouri and Pacific Northwest. But what we see down here is this starting to happen again. We saw those bad conditions in Texas. We're seeing them in the Rio Grande. And this really is a pattern, this southeast to northwest pattern is a pattern that we've often seen in drought progression as we move out of La Nina episodes and as drought progresses across the country. What we see is that a drought cycle often starts down in Texas, in the Arkansas River basins, in the Rio Grande, and then drifts towards the northwest, hitting all of these basins. And we're starting to see, we're starting to see that occur here across the Texas, Arkansas, and Rio Grande basins right now. And my forecast for you is that over the next year to 2 years, we will see those drought conditions continue to progress north and westward. All right, so that's where we were at. This is where we've come from. This is all of the secretarial drought designations for, or secretarial disaster designations, excuse me, for drought that have occurred this year. And you can see that most of the West is implicated in this. If you are in any of these counties or your constituents are in any of these counties, these are places that likely qualify for federal disaster relief around drought. Places in red are where we actually had those drought declarations. Those can be, 8 weeks in D2 level drought, severe drought, 1 week in D3, and several other qualifying drought instances. If you're in an orange county, you're just adjacent to one of those counties that have had drought. You notice that California, Nevada, we still had qualifying droughts across all of these basins because they hit right at the beginning of the year before those big atmospheric rivers started coming through. And so there's still maybe qualifying droughts for some federal relief in many of those communities. And this is a picture of where we've come over the year. So this is from the start of the calendar year. Have we gotten better in terms of drought? Those are these blue and green blobs, or have we gotten worse in terms of drought? And it really shows the picture that I showed earlier. We had tremendous moisture coming up through the Sierras and across the Great Basin and into southeastern Montana and the Dakotas over the winter, and that really provided some needed relief. But we've seen things grow progressively worse across the Midwest, the upper Midwest, and the Gulf Coast. And we can get a couple of pictures from that here. I need to hide something on my screen real quick so I can see things. What we see here is the total precipitation anomaly over the water year. So we sometimes talk about water year as being from the previous October in the Western US through the end of September. So we're coming to the end of what we traditionally consider our water year in the Western US. This is a picture of the precipitation anomaly over the course of that water year. So once again, from last October of 2022 through the end of August. And what we see is that we were at roughly 200% or more of precipitation across much of the Great Basin and in California, and then that extending all the way up into the Dakotas. That's that pattern that we were seeing before, but notice that we didn't have it in the Northern Rockies or across most of the Columbia. And that has actually been a trend that's continued even over the last 3 months. So this is just the last 3 full months. This is your summer snapshot where we continued to have pretty historic precipitation across much of this region. That's why our drought conditions just continued to improve and we're now in no drought across much of this region. But notice that we continued to have that low precipitation, much lower than average across much of the Pacific Northwest coast, north of San Francisco, and then the Northern Rockies, and then of course the horrible conditions down in Texas. That was echoed in our temperature. So it was not only wetter, but it was also cooler over the last water year across much of that swoop up the central part of the country. And even over the last 3 months, we saw cooler than average temperatures across the Great Basin, slightly cooler than average across Wyoming, but much warmer than average across the Northern Rockies, the Pacific Northwest, and across Texas. And that really matters when you're starting to look at aridity impacts and drought impacts. And it's really translated into soil moisture deficits that we see across the Western US. We've had historically high soil moisture across those areas where we've gotten so much precipitation. We've gotten really, really dry soils, some of the driest soils on record for Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Missouri, and down into the Gulf Coast. And then this is what's really scary, is just how dry the soils are compared to normal across the entire Pacific Northwest. We've been really lucky this year. There have been a couple of big fires out there, but we've been pretty lucky that this hasn't exploded with fires, and you know, there's still a lot of risk out there. When we look at our reservoir status, this was one of those top line items I was talking about, where we're still really low in Lake Powell. We're still below the Tier 1 shortage in Lake Mead down in the lower Colorado River Basin. The upper Colorado River Basin is looking pretty good. We're almost to full pool in a couple of these really high reservoirs. That's great. But it really hasn't done a ton to recharge Powell and Mead, our largest reservoirs in the Southwest, and ones that are critical for both water and energy for much of the lower Colorado River Basin and portions of Southern California. California reservoirs, on the other hand, this was the story all spring and summer long. We are very close or well above the historical average, for most reservoirs across the entirety of California, the Central Valley included. If we look at the Missouri River Basin, we're right about normal. You can think of normal as for this time of year as being right at the top of this light blue area where it's getting into this darker shade of blue, and we're right at normal on most of those. These are all very controlled reservoirs by the Army Corps of Engineers, and they're right where they were expected to be. This is the full basin, so all 4 of those reservoirs. As you can see, we started the year at a deficit much lower than average storage, but we were able to catch up because of that historic snowpack that we had in the upper Missouri River Basin, and we're right here, right at about average for the year, and that's expected to continue. All right, I want to shift to talk a little bit about El Nino, because what we have is starting in June, we moved into an El Nino phase, and it's actually shaping up to be a relatively strong El Nino phase given our historic events. An El Nino generally has its strongest impact in the winter, just like a La Nina here in North America, where we have warmer than average temperatures across the northern Rockies and the northern tier of the country, dry conditions across the Ohio and lower Mississippi River valleys, and wet conditions across the southern Rockies. Usually, I'm a skier, and I think El Niños are good skiing down in Colorado and New Mexico. La Niñas are good skiing up here in the northern Rockies. We'll see if that pans out, but it certainly is where forecasters are thinking we're moving. Here's the history of El Niño events since 2000. El Niño is actually just a measure of the Oceanic Niño Index. It's just the relative warmth of the Central Pacific, but it has huge impacts globally to weather patterns. When we're below negative 0.5, we call that a La Nina event. You can see the long period of La Nina. This was actually a triple dip. We called it La Nina, where we went down into it right before 21. So in late 20, we went into it again in 22, going into the winter of 22, and we were in a La Nina again last winter, and then transitioned out of it towards the beginning of the year. But we've had quite a steep ascent out of our La Nina conditions into an El Nino condition. El Nino is up here. Some of them you probably remember, Lee, especially where we had some pretty striking El Nino events that lead to drought in the northern tier of the country. Here in 2015 and 2016 was the strongest. Here's the projections for this last year. So last time we talked was in March, and I showed you this graph. I showed you these projections saying, oh, well, we're going to be coming out of La Nina conditions and going into El Nino conditions pretty quickly. And I always like to go back and see how well these projections were compared to what actually happened. And here it is. There we are. That's what actually happened. So if I bounce back and forth between this, you see we were spot on in terms of the projections coming out of La Nina and moving into an El Nino event as we get towards September or into September here. So we moved officially into that El Nino event in June. And here are the projections through the rest of the winter. We're looking at a moderately strong El Nino event historically, peaking on average around 1.5 in the Oceanic Niño Index. What that really means is that it would be, if we hit that mark, this would be one of the 3 strongest El Nino events that we've seen since 2000. So, so it's not one of our weak El Ninos. It's looking like it's going to be a relatively strong El Nino as we move through this winter and go into the spring. And I just want to echo what I said before, that there seems to be a pretty strong connection between El Ninos and La Ninas and this progression of drought across the contiguous US. And what I see is that it really is tied to these periods where we come out of La Nina and into El Nino conditions that start a cascade coming from the southeast to the northwest. We see that really strongly here. That 5-year drought that we talk about in California, we saw the past as prologue here in the Texas Gulf and Arkansas White Red and Rio Grande basins a year ahead of time, where we saw those basins start this trend of drought as the Central Pacific was warming up, and then that cascaded across all of these basins, culminating in the unprecedented 5-year drought across California that caused major reservoir shortages. That is what I think we're seeing again here as we've come out of La Nina. We've seen Texas and the Arkansas White and Red rivers starting to peak in terms of their drought, and I think we just need to keep an eye on these. But I'm pretty sure we're going to see this progression come up over the next year or so. All right, let's start looking at some of our outlooks first in the near term, and then we'll go into our seasonal outlooks. Unfortunately, these were some of these were published recently, but most of them that I'm going to show you were published about a month ago. And the reason is that the Climate Prediction Center actually publishes its new seasonal outlooks on Thursday. So we're a couple days early, unfortunately. But our near-term outlook, we're looking at warmer than average temperatures up here in the northern tier, the Midwest as well, very warm and very warm down in Texas. Maybe some relief in terms of precipitation, but that's likely not going to really provide a lot of relief along the Gulf, and certainly not for Wisconsin. Looking drier than average here over the next 10 days, 6 to 10 days across most of the Intermountain West. 8 to 14 days, looking about 2 weeks out. That trend continues where we've got warmer than normal temperatures. We're moving into a cooler period here, which is nice in the Northern Rockies. And hopefully this plays out where we get some good above average precipitation across the Pacific Northwest coast. This is our monthly temperature outlook. Again, sorry, this is last month's monthly outlook. So our mileage may vary in terms of this. We'll see how things look in a couple of days. But the prediction for September was above average temperatures across most of the country, and then pretty dry or normal across most of the country as well. The September, October, November 3-month outlook, again issued about a month ago, was for drier conditions than normal across the West. Or warmer and drier conditions across the West. Warmer, definitely. Drier across the Pacific Northwest and portions of New Mexico. We're really hoping for a good typical El Nino pattern for New Mexico and the Southern Rockies. It's been a real challenge. And then these are those 3-month outlooks going in to October, November, December. This here is getting to be a little bit more typical of an El Nino pattern. I'm guessing that what we're going to see issued in 2 days is going to be a stronger pattern of drier, warmer conditions in the northern tier, and then hopefully a typical pattern of wetter conditions across the southern tier of the Rockies. That translates into the monthly drought outlook, where the Climate Prediction Center and the U.S. Drought Monitor are predicting that drought development is likely in all of these yellow areas, that we're going to see effectively a filling in of drought across the central part of the country, the American bottom, and lower plains. And then that drought will persist across the Pacific Northwest and across the northern Rockies, and then over the next 3 months, perhaps expand up here in the Pacific Northwest, mainly again because of that moderately strong El Nino that we're about to be that we're experiencing. This also translates into that wildland fire potential. This was the September outlook, where we had significant above normal wildland fire potential across Hawaii, the Pacific Northwest, that upper Midwest, and then of course across that whole area that's seeing extreme drought, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Texas, and Louisiana, and over into Mississippi. That will start to abate as we get into the fall, hopefully, but they're still saying that our October outlook is pretty above normal across these regions, and that's going to be something to really look at. If we have a dry spell, if we have dry winds, and if we have any incidental starts from dry lightning, that could really be troubling across much of these regions. And then once we get into November and December, our fire season is typically over in this region. You'll recall that we had some really bad fires in November in California last year and the year before. Because of all that precipitation we've seen, we're really predicting pretty typical fire activity there. The only hot spot that persists is Hawaii, where they've been having a dramatic drought and, as we know, dramatic fires as well. So here are a couple of drought resources that I'll direct you to as we're looking into the winter. There's drought.gov, which is really a great resource for drought updates like this one, except much more frequent and sometimes more specific to particular basins. As we go out of the fire season, these will become less important, but I think they're really great resources. The EPA Air Now Fire and Smoke Map shows both EPA grade air quality monitors and the purple air, or low cost and yet still high precision air quality monitors that are all across the country. This is a really great resource for looking at smoke in your area and human impacts of it. And then I like this smoke resource as well. There's a private company called Open Snow that does a really nice smoke forecast that just uses the really near-term forecasts of wind and shows if you're going to be moving into smokier conditions. So again, this update was that drought conditions are persisting across the Central Plains and portions of the northwestern U.S. with extreme drought conditions along the Gulf Coast. Increasing in the Northern Rockies may worsen into the fall. We're really looking at our snowpack as we reset our water year and move into the fall. It'll be interesting to see how snow impacts all of our basins. We really still need another good winter. We need a typical El Nino for the Colorado River basins. Higher fire risk continues through the fall in the Pacific Northwest, Great Lakes regions, and in Hawaii. And then the big story is that we're entering an El Nino, and that typically means warmer conditions for the Northern Rockies and wetter conditions for the Southern Rockies. So thanks. Do you all have any questions?
Yeah, Kyle, can you talk a little bit more? I know it's usually out of our region, but a little bit more about how extensive the drought conditions are in Hawaii, given that we have a Hawaii team member.
Yeah, they are pretty extensive. They've actually well, I haven't been watching how they're changing, and unfortunately my animation doesn't have it. But currently what we see is the Big Island, most of it's in moderate drought, some into severe drought, and then you see spots of severe drought as we go up the archipelago. You know, this has been the story of the summer, this drought, and we usually don't think of places that like tropical places like Hawaii as being in drought, and yet what we saw this summer was that yes, these places can be in drought. Drought is just a deviation from normal in terms of aridity. It's just being a little drier than normal, right? And in this case, where we've seen the progression of invasive grasses that dry out very rapidly, it created a tinderbox across a lot of the Hawaiian Islands that led to the fires that we saw this summer. And so those conditions are continuing, and the expectation is that those drought conditions will continue into the fall in Hawaii, as we see here.
Thanks.
You bet.
I have a question for you, Kyle. How about the Colorado? How's the Colorado?
How's the Colorado? Well, the Colorado River basin was good. We had a good snowpack, although I think the story, let me go to those. Hold on. The story that kept getting told about the Colorado was that we had great snowpack. But in fact, that snowpack that we had in the Colorado wasn't everywhere. So here's what happened across the Colorado this last winter, and I don't have a good map for you, but I can describe it. We actually had a nice wet winter across the Colorado River Basin, but that water that hit the really snowy conditions mainly hit just in the Colorado River Basin. This is the divide, the Continental Divide that runs along here. And if I were to show you the same plots over on this side, which is the Arkansas River, right? Drains right out of here. If I were to show you those plots, it was extremely dry. They had huge snow deficits, a snow drought on the eastern side of the divide. And so even though we had, good snow in the Colorado River Basin, we had really dry conditions over on this side. And I think that was a big part of the story. But I will say that even though we had those good wet conditions in the Colorado River Basin, it wasn't what we had in California. It wasn't the type of snowpack to really get us into a comfortable position for Lake Mead and Lake Powell that are so important. We've got a lot of good upper basin storage. That's wonderful. But Lake Powell and Lake Mead are still remarkably low, and we should just all be hoping that this El Nino is a typical El Nino and brings wet conditions to the Colorado River Basin.
Excellent. Okay, so we have a question from Tracy. Tracy, you want to read this, or would you like me to?
I can read it.
Okay.
The last really moist, snowy winter I remember around here, like Spokane area, northern Idaho, was 2008, 2009, and it was remarkable. I just wondered, I could look it up, but was that El Nino, and how does it look compared to your models for this year?
Let's look. 2008, 2009 was a really strong La Nina year. And that's typical of the Northern Rockies. I remember, because I actually was here in 2008, that was pretty snowy. I remember 2011 as being a nice wet year, or a great year for skiing up here. I went to school at Washington State University, just south of you. And so those were pretty typical La Nina years where we had good snowpack in the Pacific Northwest and the Northern Rockies. That is not our typical El Nino pattern. So we're actually going into the opposite type pattern now, but that's a typical pattern, and it honestly is sometimes a crapshoot, Tracy. So maybe we'll get lucky and we'll get good solid precipitation across the entire West. That would be lovely. But really, if it's a typical El Nino, I expect it to be a drier winter for the Pacific Northwest and for the Northern Rockies.
Yeah, thank you. Because something that occurred to me, and I don't know if it's something studied, but I keep thinking about this cumulative drying of the forest and soils that's very incremental. And if it's not watched on a trend basis, if we're just looking at the fire season for this year, for instance, which was horrible here. We had weeks of air quality AQI above 300 and sometimes above 400 for a week. It's just that long-term drying effect that if we don't watch it, anyway, it's just a comment.
It can have a really big effect on our forests, especially. Here's a product that I've been watching lately that I think you might be interested in, Tracy. This is on the Upper Missouri River Basin Drought Indicator dashboard. It's drought.climate.gov. Maybe somebody can pop that in the chat. But if you go to this, there's a lot of different drought metrics. This is the drought dashboard that gets used by Montana every week in order to do the drought declarations, to change the drought map. But what we have here is a modeled soil moisture product called TopoFire. It's at 250 meter resolution. It's actually very high resolution, but a recent study shows that this is a very precise soil moisture model when compared to actual in situ measurements, actual soil probes that are in the ground measuring soil moisture. So we see that this has got high fidelity to what's actually going on. And what we see here is just that extreme drying out in the western part of the state, there in Washington. The whole Pacific Northwest coast is just really, really dry. Dry soil moisture conditions, and these have long-term effects on our forests. This isn't just a short-term impact. This type of aridity takes a while to recover from, especially for our trees. So, and you know, that goes for what's going on up here too. We've had some nice soil moisture relative to historic conditions across the northern Rockies and that sort of northeastern part of Washington. But this isn't showing you where we've come from, which has actually been pretty dramatically dry conditions across this region over longer timescales. This is a 180-day precipitation and evapotranspiration index. Is sort of a water balance index, and what we see are those dry conditions across through Spokane, across the Idaho Panhandle, and into the northwestern areas of Montana. So this is a tool that I like to return to regularly. And
Kelsey did put the link in the chat box for those who are interested in looking at it. Kyle, following on that, and I know we're almost out of time, but I did want to get into this. If you could go to the Highline drought conditions, I think this is important, particularly to the folks in the northern climes. And of course, lots of people were seeing smoke from Canada. So perhaps you could talk to us a little bit about what was causing the intense wildfire season in Canada without maps, recognizing your maps end at the border. And then, is there anticipated any relief for that, or is that anticipated to be worse again?
Well, the fires in Canada, there's actually a really great report about this, I think in the Washington Post just this week. The fires in Canada were both an impact of extremely dry conditions in those northern forests. And, you know, zooming out, we don't have the drought data on this map, but those fires, the biggest ones were, and now my whole thing is just not letting me dry. The biggest ones were up here in northern Alberta, northern Saskatchewan, and northern Manitoba, right? These were huge fires in very dense forests, and they were caused by extremely dry soil conditions, windy conditions that made it easy for things to start, and stand dynamics that were very homogeneous. The story that was in the paper the other day was about initiatives approximately 30 years ago that were getting youth in Canada to go plant trees. And it was a massive campaign to replant forests that had been clear cut in the northern reaches of all of these portions of Canada, and that created stands of trees that were really homogeneous in terms of their genetic structure, in terms of their age structure. You didn't have a healthy sort of natural forest in a sense. You had a bunch of trees that were all the same species, all reacting to drought the same, and all the same age cohort, just there ready to burn. And so we really had this triangulation of extreme drought conditions, with windy conditions and stand dynamics that were that just made it extremely dangerous. So to answer your question, Maureen, do we see that ameliorating? Well, we're going into the winter, so hopefully we'll see those fires end and we'll see an abatement of smoke. But the underlying problem of non-diverse forests, forests that maybe look healthy if you're in them, although all the trees are in rows, that problem I think is going to persist because that's a management problem that goes back decades. I can find that
For
article.
those who are interested, I just put the link to the Washington Post article in the chat. Thank you, Kyle. This was really great. We really appreciate you zooming in. It wasn't all bad news this time.
Not all bad news. It depends